I think about the students who are at Sarah Lawrence and at other campuses who are Zionist and proud, and they're suffering because of it. But I also think of the students, and we'll never know who they are, who would have had a relationship with Israel and now never will.
Welcome to What Came After. I'm your host, Manya Marcus. On What Came After, we'll take a look at the many ways that people's lives changed on and after the brutal massacre in Israel on October 7th, 2023. We'll be speaking with people in Israel and around the world about how the devastating attack by Hamas has shifted, shaped, and changed them. To learn more about our podcast, please visit us at whatcameafter.com. I'm really honored to welcome my guest today, Matthew Schultz. You wear many hats. I'd love to hear about all of them.
Yes, so I am a rabbinical student in my 5th year at Hebrew College. I am also a columnist for the LA Jewish Journal and an author of the book What Came Before. And I have a Substack called Dispatches from the Promised Land, which, although my dispatches aren't currently coming from the Promised Land, that's where they generally come from when I'm living in Israel.
So this illustrates an ideological perspective that it sounds like you have, which is the Promised Land is the land of Israel. And this is something that I think has really been amplified, probably for you in many respects since the beginning of the war, right? To have that feeling and that philosophy.
Yeah, it's something that I have been trying to articulate. My newest project that I'm working on is a cycle of essays about the weekly Torah portion that is specifically focused on the Jewish relationship to the land of Israel and also to the idea of exile. So trying to explore through our most basic texts, what actually does it mean when we say that this is the promised land? What does it mean when we say that it's a holy land? What makes land holy or what doesn't? What is our relationship to diaspora and exile? And I think that there's certainly not one answer to these questions. And what I am finding as I go through the text, as the lens that I'm looking through, is that it's full of paradoxes and I don't want to say contradictions. I think that they're productive tensions more than they're contradictions.
So you have a book, which you very generously gave me right before we started the interview, and it dovetails in a funny way with the name of this podcast. Your book is called What Came Before. Just handed it to me, so I'm not familiar with it yet, but what does the before reference in the title of this book?
So the title What Came Before comes from one of the essays where a bunch of people come to the men who run their town. It's sort of unclear who these authority figures are. And they want to know what was here before. That's their question. And the men keep giving them answers. Well, before this town, there was a different town. Before that town, there was a forest. Before the forest, there was a swamp. And the people are never really satisfied with the answers. So that's where the title came from. I think the bigger question that a lot of the essays in the book are asking is just about the purpose of creation myths. That's what I was sort of thinking about a lot and working through as I wrote it. And what are we looking for and what questions are we actually trying to answer when we tell ourselves a creation myth? In Judaism, we have a few different creation myths. I mean, the Torah starts out with two, I hesitate to say contradictory, but it opens with two creation myths that seem to be telling two very different stories. The Adam and Eve story does not tell the same story as Bereshit chapter 1. If you just look at the details, the chronology is different. Also, the style is different. And I think it's because these two stories are answering different questions. And then if you go to different layers of Jewish history, you get even more creation myths. The Kabbalists had their own, they didn't have one. They had multiple creation myths of their own. And I think it's because we're always asking new questions about our origins that require new stories.
And something that you just said about the essay or story from which you got the title of the book, What Came Before, reminds me that I've been thinking a lot since October 7th about what is history? When does history start? Because you see all this stuff online. Jews were here however long ago. No, Arabs were here. And it's like, at what point do we become historical or ahistorical? And I think maybe creation myths somehow intersect with that. The conversation that we're having right now is making me really happy, and it makes me nostalgic for when these were the kinds of conversations that I had in Jewish spaces. And we weren't talking about the overlap between our traditions and tragedy. Let me hear about who you've been or started to become, how October 7th has shaped the trajectory or the urgency or the shape of your work. And then if we could also backtrack and tell us a little bit about how you decided you wanted to be a rabbi.
I grew up in a very, very, I'll do three varies, secular Jewish family. Religion wasn't a big part of our lives. And also Zionism and Israel were not part of our lives either. And I think I went to a synagogue growing up. We went a couple times a year, and I've come to realize the extent to which this is a rare experience. It was certainly not an anti-Zionist synagogue, but neither was it a Zionist synagogue. It was like Israel just wasn't part of our Jewish story in a very big way. It's just quietly
there.
Yeah. So I became more interested in religion in high school and in spirituality, and in college became more observant Jewishly. And that's when I went to Israel for the first time for my year abroad during my junior year.
I want to pause you for a second and say that you went to Sarah Lawrence.
Yes, I did go to Sarah Lawrence.
And so for people who are familiar with Sarah Lawrence and its most recent history, it's a very interesting thing that you were able to go to Israel from that college.
Yes. And I would like to speak about that. Sarah Lawrence is in the throes of something right now that a lot of colleges are in the throes of. And I saw, I can't speak for the veracity of this photo, but what I saw was an image of flyers and pamphlets that the Gaza encampment at Sarah Lawrence was handing out to students. And one of them had sort of a graphic painted image of Sinwar's face, the head of Hamas, who is now dead. And it said, "Sometimes history needs a push," which is a quote from someone, I don't know who. And push was crossed out and it said a flood. So the Al-Aqsa flood is the Hamas name for October 7th. Sometimes history needs October 7th.
Right.
That to me is no different than handing out pictures of Hitler. I don't like the constant comparisons to Hitler that we have in our society. I don't think it's necessarily good or healthy for our discourse or our politics. In this case, I really do think that it's an apt comparison. And I think that the only difference is in the extent to which they were successful in their project of killing Jews. Sinwar, to his own dismay, was a less successful Hitler. But I think on a moral level, they are figures of the same moral standing, which is to say they are evil men. So I posted about this on my Instagram. Some students from Sarah Lawrence wrote to me, Jewish students, who have been terrorized this whole year. And when I was there, that was not the case. It was a long time ago. It was 2010, so over a decade ago. Yeah, having no Zionist education up until that point, what I learned about Israel, I learned from being there, from going abroad. And
can I pause just for one second? When you discussed with your peers or your professors that you wanted to go to Israel for your study abroad year, do you recall what their reactions were? Did you get any pushback?
So I have this one vague memory. It's quite vague, of a friend of mine, a close friend, saying something. We're in a room, I was talking about Israel, and she said something about Israel being a colonizer. I don't know what it was, but I heard her turn to someone else and say this thing. This is someone who has come at me this year quite aggressively online for speaking in defense of Israel. So it all sort of makes sense. But that was the only person who said something, and they said it quietly.
What a difference a decade and a half
What a difference
makes.
a decade has. If I was there today, I probably would have never gone to Israel. If everyone was telling me that this is the worst, most evil place on earth, I had no Israel education that would have suggested to me that maybe I should think twice about what they're saying. So I would have never gone. I would have never seen for myself. My life would, I think, have been the worse for it, for not having had that chance to encounter Israel. So I think about the students who are at Sarah Lawrence and at other campuses who are Zionist and proud, and they're suffering because of it. But I also think of the students, and we'll never know who they are, who would have had a relationship with Israel and now never will. And even little things. I remember the first time I Googled the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I read the Wikipedia page. At this point in my life, I've read on this many books on the subject, but that was the first thing I read was the Wikipedia page. If you look at the Wikipedia page today for Zionism, it's insane. Zionism is an ethno-cultural colonization project that desires as much land and as few Palestinians as possible. It's the first sentence of the article.
You sound like you really know that. Like you've got that down.
Yeah.
That is that real?
That's real.
That's wild.
So all these entry points for people to start having a discussion about Israel, start thinking about Israel in a critical way, are being cut off at the head and steering people's perceptions very sharply in one really extreme ideological direction. It's not like the Wikipedia page before was the opposite of that. It's not like it was a Zionist propaganda page. It was the whole complicated history written by the many hands of Wikipedia. But anyways, back to the narrative. After college, I lived in New York for just a couple of years and knew that that year in Jerusalem that I studied abroad was so important to me, and I had gotten so much from it and formed such powerful relationships that I knew I wanted to make Aliyah and move back. So in 2012, I did that. I made Aliyah, and I was there until 2020 when I started rabbinical school
Where did you live for those 8 years?
in Tel Aviv.
Okay, so there's something I want to amplify right now because it hasn't come up yet, which is that you are a gay man.
Mhm.
Right? I don't know if you say that you're part of a queer community or how would you identify yourself?
I would say I'm a gay man.
You're a gay man. Okay. Obviously, there's been a lot of press about how the LGBTQ queer community is reacting to Israel, to Zionists. Do you feel like you are at cross purposes across these identities, and also how was it to be a gay man in Jerusalem when you were there for that first year?
So the first question, most of my gay community is in Tel Aviv. So for me, my gay community is not anti-Israel.
They're in Israel.
They're in Israel. Now, a lot of them are very far left. A lot of them are very involved in the anti-Bibi protest movement. And a lot of them have critiques about the management of this war too, which is, they're leftists in Israel. But there's a difference between being a leftist in Israel and being a leftist in America, because at the end of the day, no one who lives in Israel is going to embrace an ideology that supports a Hamas terrorist coming into your grandmother's house.
Right.
We say the political is personal.
Yeah.
If you have skin in the game, that's just going to change your perspective. I think that all of this to Americans, it's very virtual, and they don't understand the true consequences necessarily for people who live on the ground. And the reason I didn't leap to apply the word queer to myself
Yeah.
is because I understand gay as a description of my sexual orientation, and I have come to understand queer as a political term, and those are not my politics in most cases, especially in terms of how it's been applied to Israel.
Do you ever get pushback from other gay men, anybody, about the fact that you're a Zionist being some kind of betrayal of this other part of who you are? Does that exist in your life anywhere? Maybe online even?
No, that hasn't come up for me. And yeah, like I said, my gay community is tends to be Zionist. Yeah, as for your second question, what's it like to be gay in Jerusalem? For me, it's been fine. What makes their eyes pop out of their heads a little bit is if I'm holding my partner's hand while I'm wearing my kippah. So if you're holding your partner's hand, okay, you're one of those chilonim, you're one of those secular people, whatever. If you're holding your partner's hand while wearing a kippah, now I don't know what box to put you in. I might find you threatening. And that is when I get dirty looks. But that's kind of the extent of it. It was dicier walking around holding a partner's hand in Boston after a Red Sox game got out than I ever felt in Jerusalem.
I believe that. And we are doing this interview, by the way, in Boston.
Yes.
Okay, so you decided after 8 years in Israel that you wanted to go to rabbinical school. That was COVID when you made that decision.
Mhm.
What drew you specifically to Hebrew college?
Hebrew college is a non-denominational school. That's sort of the special thing about it. It's not connected to a movement. The result of that is that they don't tell you how to be a Jew or how to be a rabbi. What they do is make sure that you're extremely literate with Jewish sources. So it's a deeply, deeply text-based program. And then what you're going to do with those sources is up to you in your own personal rabbinate and in the communities that you choose to join. So I was drawn to that. I was drawn to the rigorousness of the text study. And I also think that Judaism has a noble history of decentralization. And
I knew you were going to say that word.
really?
Yeah. I was just holding back. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think the issue for me with denominations is just that they're a little top heavy, perhaps, or too centralized, and it starts to feel perhaps stifling in some way to the ability of the tradition to just be the way it has throughout history.
And what has Hebrew college been like since October 7th?
Well, when this Sarah Lawrence student reached out to me after talking about what they've gone through on the Sarah Lawrence campus, they mentioned that they are also considering rabbinical school. And I didn't have the heart to tell this person that they're going to deal with hard stuff at rabbinical school also. Anti-Zionism is really, really common at Hebrew college. And what does that mean? It's just a word, it's just a term. It can mean a lot of different things, and people use it a lot of different ways. It's important for me when I speak to people to actually figure out how they're using a term rather than judging them for using a term. So I don't think that everyone who uses the term anti-Zionist to describe their politics wants harm to come to the Jewish people who live in Israel. But at the same time, I have encountered views and perspectives that hurt me. I'll just make it personal. It hurts me to think of a certain level of callousness towards the plight of Israelis, a lack of sympathy, a lack of concern. I don't want to get into the particular stories of what I've witnessed at Hebrew College, but I can say that a lot of it has been somewhat shocking and makes me concerned about the future of the Jewish world, because I just feel like if we don't stand up for us, who will? And I think that there is a beauty in the fact that we, as a Jewish community, try to see beyond ourselves and try to see beyond our communal boundaries. And I think there's beauty in the fact that Jews are really trying to hold the pain of the Palestinian people and their very real suffering throughout this war, and make sure that we confront it as Jewish communities and take that in as part of the story of this year, because that is also what came after.
Yes.
But there does come a point when you only see that to the exclusion of your own community's pain. And that's where I think we get into dangerous territory.
You just made me wonder if we are unique in that. Are there other communities that have a hard time looking inwards in the way that maybe liberal Jews do? I think Orthodox Jews are in a different category. They often have their own institutions. What do you think about that? It seems like Jews sometimes have a really hard time acknowledging that they have needs.
Actually, I don't see it as a Jewish thing. I see it as a quality of the American left where there's sort of a reflexive self-condemnation, like America is a trash country. We do this on the left a lot in America where we relate to our own. I don't know why I'm saying the word we. I don't know if I fully relate anymore with the American left
But
as
you
I used
have.
to.
Yeah, but you used to.
Where we or they, where the American left comes down on its own history or relates to its own history through a lens of either guilt or just condemnation without feeling the guilt. And I think that in a very, very far left Jewish world, as the American non-Orthodox Jewish world is, that also gets applied to Jewish history. The same sort of knee-jerk assumption that there's something a little messed up about all of this, and that we shouldn't just be celebrating Israel or Jewish history or whatever. I saw this woman on Twitter. I'll say her name. It was Ariel Gold, I think her name is, from Code Pink. Very, very active anti-Israel voice. And at Purim, she posted, just a reminder, Purim is the celebration of a massacre that the Jews committed against the Persians. Okay, you're so deep in this like American History X version of looking at things that now you're doing it to Purim also.
Mm-hmm.
And this is how you see the world now.
Now, is she somebody that you follow because you used to align with her, or like?
No, I just back when
Curious.
I was active on Twitter, I'm not anymore because would just get into fights with people. She was one of the people that I enjoyed fighting with, but I decided it was no longer healthy.
Yeah.
And so now I no
Good for
longer
you. Good
post
for
on
you.
Twitter actively.
Okay. But I see what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Were you on campus during October 7th?
I was in Israel. I was in Tel Aviv with my partner Yoav. He's also a rabbinical student at Hebrew Union College, and he's in the fully Israeli program, so he's still there right now. Yeah, we had the most beautiful Simchat Torah of my life at our community in Tel Aviv, Keilat Sinai, dancing with the Torah out in the street, and it was just a perfect night with that community. We came home, woke up the next day to this fire alarm going off at a school. One of the rockets had triggered a fire alarm at a school and it was going off, and it was our neighbor who told us over the balcony there's a war going on. So we didn't know what was happening. We generally don't use technology on Shabbat, but we turned on our computer not to look at the news. My assumption was that this was just another volley of rockets from Gaza, which I've lived through that many times before. So we just watched TV to sort of distract ourselves, and then we watched a movie, and by the time the movie ended and we looked at the news, everything was becoming clear. And the video of Noah Argamani being taken was circulating. And yeah, we had no idea how far north they would come. We barricaded ourselves in the bedroom, got food, had a shoehorn for self-defense if we just didn't know. And then I think there was a direct hit in Florentine, which of a rocket, and
That's a neighborhood in Tel Aviv, yeah?
yeah, very close to where we were in South Tel Aviv. So we were just sitting on the bed, and when there was a siren, we would just hold hands and hold our breath and wait to hear the boom. But it was, yeah, terrifying, bizarre, long night.
When you talk about having been there, on October 7th and how terrifying that was. When I sort of juxtapose that with this comment that people can't hold Israeli or Jewish pain, do you feel like people do not take your experience of that day seriously?
I haven't personally had that experience with other people, but I did have a conversation with Yoav today that sort of maps onto what you're saying, which someone in his class was giving a presentation, and he was also talking about his time in Miluim and in reserves, fighting in Gaza. And then Yoav, in the same day, had a conversation with someone who her family is from Kfar Blum, which is in the north, which has been very badly hit in this conflict, who is saying that only now that there's a ceasefire can she really start to process the destruction of her region of the country, her community, her life, And Yoav was talking about how both of these experiences, hearing about the reserves and hearing about this woman from the north, made him realize that he is very insulated in Tel Aviv. So I think that, what does it mean to be insulated from a conflict? In America, we fight wars that are oceans away. We're often at war when we don't even know it. I think if you had asked a lot of Americans in the past 20 years, does America have active military conflicts? And if so, where? A lot of people would not be able to answer that question. We don't feel it. We don't know soldiers in a lot of communities. For some communities, obviously, the military is a big part of life and culture, but a lot of times in the Northeast, you're completely insulated. So if that's your reference point, then what me and Yoav went through on October 7th is extremely close to the conflict and not insulated at all. We had rockets over our head and we had an invasion. We're in Massachusetts right now. Like, how comfortable would someone in Boston feel knowing that there was a military invasion of a foreign army in Cape Cod? They wouldn't feel insulated from that. They'd be like, that's here.
That's right
That's
here.
here. That's
Yeah.
in my state. They'd be terrified. But because everything is relative, we also do feel like there in Tel Aviv, in the center of the country, where, Israel is a country with very thin margins, but that's where you get the most margin. So we do feel insulated. And, I think that's okay. I think that's the truth of the matter. Our experience was our experience, but, I think it's more important to make space for people who really have had their lives either, completely disrupted, in some cases ended, had family members kidnapped. That's a level of experiencing this war that if you're not going through it, you can empathize deeply, but you can't really imagine.
Are you planning on moving back to Israel when you're done with rabbinical school?
Yes. So Yoav has, by the time I finish, he'll have 2 more years of school.
When will you finish this year?
Yeah, at the end of this year.
Great.
So I'll move back then and we'll have 2 more years in Israel, definitely. And then we'll see after that. Non-Orthodox rabbis were less hireable in Israel than in America. The jobs are fewer and they don't pay as well. But at the same time, helping to be a part of the project of building Israeli Judaism is important to me. And so far in my life, I've chosen that over most other things, chosen being in Israel over a lot of other values. So we'll see how the competing values continue to duke it out. But
Do you feel, it sounds like you feel a sense of real concern about Jews in the diaspora. Is it different than the concern you feel about Israeli Jews?
I feel the exact opposite concerns about each. I wish American Jews were a little more conservative. I wish Israeli Jews were a little more liberal. I think that the two communities have a lot to learn from each other in a very complementary way. The things that threaten Jewish American life A big part of that story is assimilation. Of the many threats that Israeli Jews face, that's not one that's on the table for them. So, yeah, I think that American Jews could learn a lot about what it means to be a people and to feel pride and about resilience from Israeli Jews. And I think Israeli Jews could learn a lot about, I want to bring this to my Torat Ha'Aretz. That's what I call my drashot about the weekly parsha. Drashot, my weekly essays on the Torah portion through the lens of the Jewish relationship to the land of Israel. I call it Torat Ha'Aretz, the Torah of the land. When Avraham comes to Ephron the Hittite in Parshat Chayei Sarah to purchase the land of Israel, he says, Ani ger v'toshav. I'm a sojourner and a resident. And the Midrash says, what's a ger? What's a sojourner? It's a tenant. What's a toshav? It's a landlord. So there's a paradox. How can you be the landlord and the tenant? We're supposed to have these dual identities of ger v'toshav. I think it's really important for what it means to be a Jew. And when you're really strong in one, you need to be reminded of the other. In a discussion of the laws of Shemitah, agricultural laws in the Torah, God says you can't sell the land forever because you don't really own it. And then God uses the same term again. You're gerim v'toshavim imadi. You're just sojourner residents here. This is really God's land. So the discussion of the agricultural laws comes right when they're about to enter the land. They're about to take hold of it, and they're about to really get the keys to the castle. They're about to be the landlords. And God's saying, yeah, hold on. You're going to be acting like the landlords, but don't forget that you are also the tenants here. In Chayei Sarah, it's the opposite. Abraham is coming towards this Hittite king, leader, who he's the landlord. And Abraham is the lowly sojourner who has no claims to the land. So there, the Ger Toshav is a reminder. What he's saying, I know I'm just a sojourner here, but I also have a claim to this land because this is the land that God has promised to my people. So you're always supposed to remember the opposite quality so that you don't become consumed with one mindset or the other. This is something Chaim Bialik also says.
A Zionist poet, yes?
Yes. Israel's national poet, I think. He has an essay, I forget the title of the essay, but he says the genius of the Jewish people is this dual nature. And he views Jewish history, the in and out of the land. He says, when it's time to learn the lessons of expansion, we go out into the diaspora. When it's time to learn the lessons of contraction, we come into the land of Israel. So where are we today? Today we're in both places. We have almost exactly the same amount of Jews in Israel and in the United States and more in the rest of the diaspora. So we're learning the lessons of expansion and contraction simultaneously, and we need to teach it to each other. I think that in America, we don't want to expand so much that the balloon pops.
What is it about, first of all, that was beautiful, but also what is it about October 7th that feels like it's filling the balloon with so much air that it's going to pop? Something has changed.
I think it's a lot of different things. I think part of it is, again, just the fact that Jews on the left in America see things through the prism of the left. They don't see things through the prism of their Jewish identity. So if the left in America is lockstep against Zionism and against Israel, there's not enough compelling them to go against that. There's a lot of different angles that you could come at this question of why are American Jews turning against Israel? Why are American Jews turning against Zionism? And not in all cases, but in large numbers.
Mm-hmm.
I had an interesting conversation with an anti-Zionist Jew who said that, I thought this was fascinating. He said that if he had been around in the 1930s, he thinks he would have been a Zionist pioneer. And all of a sudden I got what he was saying. He's a rebel at heart. And the early Zionists were rebels who scandalized their parents and turned their parents' sense of what it means to be a good Jew on its head.
Yeah.
And that's what he's doing now with the polite American Zionist Jewish tradition that he inherited. He's rebelling against it and turning it on its head.
Would he disagree with that characterization?
No, I think he would agree with it.
Interesting. Okay.
So I think that there's a rebellious streak in American progressive Judaism. And I think that Zionism is associated with the Jewish establishment. So that sets up a dynamic for a lot of people to be like, okay, I'm going to be the rebel. Yeah. And I wonder, like, who would I have been back then? You know, maybe I'm more of a rule following type. Maybe I would have been like, no, these Zionists are too radical back then. But now in this context, or perhaps it depends on what you're rebelling against or what your context is. A lot of people have this narrative they come with where they say, my day school lied to me about Israel. My summer camp lied to me about Israel.
I hear that a lot.
Now, I never got a rosy picture of Israel. In fact, kind of the opposite, because I grew up with not intense anti-Zionism around me, but sort of an ambient sense that Israel was the bully in the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. It wasn't until later when I started working for the Jewish Journal and started reading a lot more news from a lot more different sources that I started to question that narrative and say, maybe Israel isn't actually the bad guy here. So my framework, I'm rebelling against something else. We all want to smash the idols of what we were told is truth and that you can't question.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on what idol you were handed, you know, that means that's the idol you're going to smash. The tricky part is to not just go and grab another idol off the shelf and worship that one instead, which is to say another ossified, simplistic, reductive political ideology that, having adopted it, you no longer have to think freely about what you're talking about.
Well, this interview reminds me why I choose not to do video. Because I'm just bowing, and I agree with everything that you're saying so profoundly. Let me ask you the question of the podcast. What has changed for you on any level that you'd like to speak about now that you haven't already since October 7th?
So for the first 8 years that I lived in Israel, I'm not sure if I would have called myself a Zionist. I was under the illusion that I was an expat and that it happened to be Tel Aviv, but who knows? It could have been Paris. It could have been wherever. I think that was never true, but I believed it was true. And eventually I started realizing that I am a Zionist. My connection to this place isn't just that I found this really amazing city on the Mediterranean where the food's great, everyone's beautiful, I can smoke cigarettes inside. You know, I was a smoker at that point in my life. Eventually, I started to get that the connection was deeper than that. And it was about being part of the Jewish story and the deeper meta narratives of Jewish history as I understood them. Still, I wouldn't have said it out loud because I understood that it's a controversial word. And like I said before, these labels can be deceptive. When you say, I'm a Zionist, maybe someone is going to hear, when you say that, someone's going to hear you saying, I'm a fascist. Well, I didn't want that kind of miscommunication. So I avoided saying it. And instead, I tried to speak in more nuanced terms. After October 7th, I say I'm a Zionist, and I don't apologize for it because I see now what the stakes are for this word. The assault on the word Zionism, the attempt to have it thrown into the same pen as racism, sexism, Islamophobia, Zionism. You literally see that in places. That is an assault on the very idea of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel. So as long as those are the stakes, since October 7th, I've understood what the stakes are. I no longer find that it's tenable to be timid about calling oneself a Zionist. And I don't think we need to put any words in front of it. Liberal Zionist, but I really hate Bibi. Just say it and say it proudly and let the chips fall where they may.
Final question. What are the stakes? What do you imagine to be the stakes?
I hate to say this as an answer to the final question because it's grim, but I think the attempt to isolate Israel from its allies abroad and to isolate it diplomatically is a step one. And the step two is destroying Israel and destroying the people of Israel while the world stands silent, as it did during the Holocaust. And God forbid, truly God forbid, that anything like that should ever happen. But I do think that those are the stakes of Jewish history and survival, which is to say survival are the stakes of Jewish history. I believe that we will survive, and I don't believe that the Jews are alone. I believe that we have a lot of allies, and that's different than other times in history. But we also have enemies, and those enemies have allies too, and those enemies are playing the long game, so we have to as well.
You're going to be a rabbi. I'll give you a chance to end with something less grim, if you would like.
Yes. So this is what I would say. When we talk about what it means to support Israel, what do we talk about? We talk about donations, posting things, tweeting this, putting up hostage posters, writing to your senator about hostages. All of that is wonderful and great. But I really think that the core of Zionism is a loving connection to the land of Israel and to the people of Israel. So go love Israel. Cook an Israeli recipe. This sounds so cheesy, but I really believe this. To cook an Israeli recipe or to read an Israeli book or to listen to Hebrew music. If your relationship to Israel is all in the culture war around Israel, it's too negative. It's too dark. You'll be sucked into the black hole of it. You need to find a connection to something positive that fills you with inspiration and love.
And how about go visit Israel?
And of course, go visit Israel.
Matt, this has been really, really wonderful. Thanks for spending the time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe to What Came After wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us online at whatcameafter.com.
אבקש אותך בכוונותיי, עד שתגיע אליי, תגיע אליי. אהבתי מפוזרת ברחובות, תשלחו אותו, עד שתתגלה לפניי, בלי הכיסויים, בלי המחיצות. עד שיתגלה אלוהים מתוך הערפל בסוד המשיכות. מבקש אותך בכוונותיי, עד שתגיע אליי, תגיע אליי. אהבתי מפוזרת ברחובות, תשלחו אותו, עד שתתגלה לפניי, בלי הכיסויים, בלי המחיצות. עד שיתגלה אלוהים מתוך הערפל בסוד המשיכות. עד שתרפא אותי מגעגועי הקדש אותך באמונה רבה. אחזיק חזק ואשמור עליי, עד שתגיע אליי, תגיע אליי. אהבתי מתגלגלת בין השמות, תשלחו אותו, עד שתתגלה לפניי, בלי הכיסויים, בלי המחיצות. עד שיתגלה אלוהים מתוך הערפל בסוד המשיכות. עד שתרפא